I think it's a requirement to be a human being that you look for a way to lift up others. I mean, I just think that's it. I knew that the problem that I'd see from working in a small business was it's really hard to form a team around a founder, and the dynamics and trying to get those leadership teams to work together so that they can grow the business was really hard. And I thought, I can help that. Irony for me is I didn't know EOS even existed at that moment. Gino Wickman, probably about that time, was just commercializing EOS. And so as hard as it was, I had to do it. I had to fail at Michigan Tech. I had to get fired at my job one time. And these things happen because they help you then help the next people.
So I really feel like those that are watching today, if they watch all the way through, they're going to get just decades of experience and knowledge, not just from you, but from those that you work with and those you've had the chance to connect with, because you've made a career out of helping individuals and businesses get more out of their business. So individuals get more out of their business. And through that, hopefully achieve some level of success, which they've defined, their why, right? And help them get towards that. So I guess really just want to thank you for jumping in today, being so generous with your time and your knowledge, and diving into the Engineer Success podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me. And when you say decades of success, it kind of makes me feel old, Stephen.
Well, I was trying to tie it into like how many different individuals in life you've had the chance to touch, and we can cultivate all of those different individuals, which probably is more than decades, right? If you look at all the different business owners you've had the chance to work with and understanding and really guide, take all of those years and pull them together, right? You've only been doing this for 2 or 3 years. That's a joke, right?
Yeah.
Doing it for a while.
Okay, I got it. So now we're getting used to each other.
Yeah.
But and it's fun when you look back. I mean, the decades is actually a positive. Because when you actually meet people and you begin to draw on your background, it really helps you kind of guide people through really hard spots. Because I've always found when you've been through the tough stuff, it makes it much easier to bring empathy into other people's tough stuff. And that brings presence, and there's a lot of things that will come from that. I'm sure we'll get into some of that as we go.
Yeah, and that's really, if you're ready to dive in, that's really I want to go, because I am curious to understand who Scott needed to become this person that can be so confidently jump into businesses and help them be more successful and help them grow. So let's back way up to your journey of how you became who you are today.
Yeah.
And so let's start with, tell me a little bit about young Scott growing up.
Well, and thinking back on it, one of the things I remember, my kids came back from school one day and they said, Scott, Dad, we're privileged. And I said, well, what's privilege? And they said, well, if you have to ask, that means you are. And I laughed about that because that was kind of a word that was new to me. I grew up in a good family. I mean, I credit my mom and dad, married for over 50 years. The things I can remember as a kid that kind of formed me in it, when I thought about that question, I thought about the idea that every holiday we went to Grandma and Grandpa's house somewhere. Like I never spent Christmas or Thanksgiving at home. And it reminded me of I just thought it was normal to hang with family, to not go do your own thing, but to do things with the generation, that skipped generation. And I didn't realize how formative that was for me, other than the fact that when I got older, I like to be around family. I mean, I like to have memories with people close to me. And that was, the importance of family was huge. The other thing that was a huge thing for me when I was a kid, and this came more in my teens, is I went through young life. And it was weird to make a choice from a faith perspective on your own. And that was when religion became less about the institution and more about what you believed. I thought those were kind of two things that have helped guide me a little bit to this point where I am in my life.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that and sharing that example of how every holiday you got the chance to spend that with family. Now, was that local in Michigan? Where were you born and raised?
Born in Midland.
Okay.
Grandpa was in a place called Hibbing, Minnesota, up in the Iron Range.
Okay.
A 2-day drive back in the day. And then my grandma was in Ann Arbor.
Okay.
And so between those two places, those were my home away from home on holidays. And one way or another, we were going one way. I mean, we never, ever stayed home for holidays. We were always on the road, and it was cool.
Now, tell me a little bit about what your parents did growing up. Were they working, more of the 9 to 5? Were they kind of the entrepreneur type style? Can you tell me a little bit about what they did?
Not entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Dad worked at a place called Dow Chemical.
Okay. Yep.
And it was really interesting about his job because he had an MBA from Stanford. And so a lot of, his pedigree from an education would expect you're going to go to the top. And I think Dad around work, I never sensed him saying work is everything. Work was a means, and he didn't dislike his job. He never complained about it, but he never, he made a decision. I can remember this when I was a kid. He made a decision because at the time Dow used to move people all over the world. And he made a decision not to go to Asia and uproot us. He made a decision to stay in Midland. And so what I remember about my dad's job was less about what he did, but how he approached it. And my mom was a teacher. She taught, and then she stayed home with us up and through about when I was 12. And then she went back part-time. So through high school, she was working half days. Mm. And I remember one time asking her about work, and she goes, I love my job, but I also love being a mom. And so, I've never met a more dedicated teacher than my mom. She was all in on whatever she did, but yet she also recognized that all in sometimes doesn't always have to be work. And so those two things that's what my parents did, and that's kind of what they taught me from their work.
Yeah, really laying an early foundation of the importance of family, right? Not just with what they said, but then with the actions. You always kind of think about, like, people say, like, show me, or I can tell what you value by looking at your bank account and your calendar, right? Just a couple of those things. And you just mentioning, not just what your parents were saying, your mom saying this is important of being a mom, I like my job, but I love being a mom, but also they backed it up with their calendar by making intentions to take the 2-day drive and go spend time with, the grandparents and make sure that value is instilled young on. What are some other maybe potential foundational things that you can think back of and you're like, man, that's something that's really impacted my future from a childhood state?
Yeah, and I think the one of the things my parents always stressed was learning. I joke about it, but as a kid, I never went to a zoo. Like, I always we'll take my kids to, we took them, to an amusement park or a zoo or someplace fun. I said, when I went to Chicago, I did 4 days in museums, guys. 4 days in museums. And frankly, I was cranky by about day 3, and they dragged me through the last one. But that sense of learning and the idea of I want to learn, I think that's been just foundational for me. Because even as, you mentioned decades, the decades go by kind of fast, but you always look forward to the next decade if you look forward to something like, what am I going to learn in the next decade? And that's always been something that's just kind of been foundational for me. It's introduced me to new ideas. It's allowed my career, my career pivots to go a little smoother. When I've changed jobs, it makes it easier because you jump into a new role, not afraid of what you're going to get, but the idea that I get to learn. When I walk into a room with a new client, I have the greatest clients in the world, and the industries I get to understand, it's just like, it's a museum with people and business, I love that. And that was foundational for me.
Yeah. And that, that curiosity and wanting to learn makes almost, sometimes I've seen it, you make a game out of it, right? It's kind of like, okay, what am I going to learn today? I've got to learn something new every single day, and it turns into a little bit of a game. So you grew up in the area. You told me a little bit about your family. Did you have an older brother, sister, siblings, anything like that?
Yeah, I have an older brother. 2 years older than me.
Okay.
I followed him my whole life. I went to the same school he went to. I joined the same fraternity. I love my brother. I have a lot of respect for him, and we've had a great friendship.
And what school is that?
Michigan Tech University.
Michigan Tech.
I'm a Husky.
Yeah. What'd you go to Michigan For?
Well, that's the funny story. I went there to be an engineer. Okay. And the only reason I chose it was metallurgical engineer because they gave me a scholarship.
Okay.
I'm like, you give me I'll study anything if you're going to give me money. And at that time, it was a third of my salary and room and board, which was pretty big.
Yeah.
At the time. And I remember going up there. And the funny thing is about 2.5 years in, my grades started great, like Dean's List first semester. I'm like, I got this. Little by little, I got into the heavy engineering class. By the 2.5 years in, I was just like, I was on probation. I was failing all my classes, hated my classes. And I decided, but I love Michigan Tech. I love the friends I'd made. I love the North. I love being outside. I love fishing, hunting. And there was a moment in time when I was probably going to get, if I didn't do something different, I was going to get kicked out. And I remember calling home and I asked my parents, I said, hey, Mom, Dad, I'm not doing well. And they knew that. We spent about a year trying to figure out what's next for me. Like, what's the ideal career for me? Because I was struggling with that. And they said, I said, I'd like to come home and then I'll come back in the next semester in like 4 weeks. And they said, no, Scott, you're not coming home. Figure it out. I'm like, what? I can't come home? So it's like, grow up. But yeah, that's why I went. Michigan Tech and I still love it up there. My wife is from the UP, and my kids all know when I cross the Mackinac Bridge, it's like, it takes a deep breath, and that's his happy place.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story too. And I'm curious, you said you kind of went through a stage a little bit where your grades started to decline and you started to kind of rethink, hey, is this for me? Is this not for me? Then you had a conversation with your parents, but like, what do you think led towards it? Was it just difficulty? Was it difficulty with the courses? Was it kind of the environment? What were some of the things that you feel like led towards maybe a shift in priorities for you at that stage?
I just, engineering is again, a wonderful, all my friends are engineers basically. And I just struggled with the theoretical all the time. And there never seemed to be a person or empathy or the ability to look at someone and kind of get them. I mean, that's kind of a gift I have, is the connectedness, the relator, to be able to see an individual and to be able to kind of, that's what charges me. And not that engineers aren't people focused, but a lot of the engineering work is more problem focused. And as you get into higher and higher level engineering, you have to be smart, you have to be disciplined, and you have to love solving problems. And it got to the point where I wasn't loving it anymore. And I couldn't fake it. I've never been good at faking. And that became kind of the turning point for me when I just struggled. And it's not like I wasn't smart enough. It just wasn't me. And it's too hard of a curriculum to fake it. I have tons of respect for my engineering friends, super smart people. And I couldn't fake it.
Now, you had that conversation, your parents said, stay there, figure it out. Did you end up graduating with an engineering degree, or did you end up switching things around?
I actually, at the time, Michigan Tech had a pretty cool degree called Operations Management, which is now MLM, which is now it's supply chain. And you had the ability, like at Michigan Tech, you had, to graduate with a business degree, you have to have a full year of programming, you have to have calculus, full year calculus, full year physics, and I had all that done. So switching over wasn't that big of a deal. And it was a little bit more of a technical degree. And it was mainly more of, at the time, choosing a degree that was in business and my stuff transferred over fairly simply. And so that helps me. I wasn't really an accountant. I wasn't a finance person necessarily. So it was kind of, I don't want to say it was by default, but it was probably the best choice, and stay at Michigan Tech.
Yeah, we'll get into a little bit of this later. I don't want to jump too far forward, but as we get into some of your career and some of the positions that you've had over the years, even leading into before what you're doing right now, you can tell that there's a people component in a lot of those, right? You look through some of those past positions, and even just understanding what you were doing, you would lead individuals in a very intentional way, and empathy probably came up multiple different times throughout those conversations and through those roles.
That is true.
Which was awesome to see. And just connecting that back to early on in college, you realized that people were a big part of what you wanted your future to be like, which has me thinking a little bit, as we get into the first couple roles that you had and on your journey towards your definition of success, were there any like aha moments throughout those early years of your life that you're like, okay, that was something, maybe that's one of them in college, but maybe there's others that you think back to as like, man, if I would have made this decision, I would have gone in a completely different trajectory than where I am today.
Yeah, and I think of decision points. The funny thing at the time, like going to college wasn't even an option. It's just, that's what you did. So for me, it wasn't a big decision point. I knew I would go to college. I think probably the biggest decision point was when I first got out of college is where I was going to take my first job. And a lot of my friends went to Detroit because that's where they were from. And I chose to try to look somewhere else. I wanted to go to Minneapolis, maybe Chicago. And it was to kind of chart a path maybe that was different. And which, again, is kind of against what you just talked about. I like to be around people, friendships, relationships. And I chose not to do that I'm not saying that was a great decision, but that was my decision. And I ended up in a steel company in like Northwest Indiana. And that was probably my first choice from a career perspective. Not a great choice in the sense that I learned a lot. That's where I met my wife, was in Chicago through some friends. So a lot of good things happened from that. I don't know if it was a great career choice, but that was it.
Yeah.
And that was it. And I would say that was a pretty big one for me.
And what was that role?
I was, believe it or not, I was a programmer.
Okay.
So I joined, I was, at the time they called it a business analyst. And there was a tool called SaaS, which is not software as a service necessarily, but it was SaaS. It was basically I pulled data out of this huge database to help my department, which was a bunch of people scheduling a steel mill. So I was kind of the business data analyst. So I literally, kind of to your point where I loved people and that connection. And guess what? My first job was a programmer. Great decision. Imagine that. I mean, I programmed for almost 7 years. I stood behind it, and I know a lot about pulling data out and making reports and building systems and stuff, which was kind of a weird thing for me, but it didn't get better. By the way, my career didn't feel better or get better until I finally extricated myself from that. But I did that for 8 years.
Why'd you do it for 8 years?
Because I was good at it. I mean, I was in a steel mill. The average age was 47. And for those 4 years, I actually, almost 5 years, I was the only person who knew how to use a computer in the department. And I was good at it. And I remember at the time, my mom did, but my dad never really loved his job. Career was just a paycheck. It was a way to make a living, and he worked hard at it, but he didn't love it. I didn't think you had to love your job. So I did it mainly because it was a job, and it paid me pretty well, and I got to do stuff on the weekends, and I met my wife, and I ended up going to grad school, on the side. I was going at night because I love to learn. And so there were a lot of positive things going on in my life, but work was just work. And then when I left grad school and actually came to West Michigan, I literally got a job because I knew how to get data out of systems and share it with people. So I did almost the same job, but in a more of a manufacturing environment. And that was for about 3 years. So roughly it was about 7 years. I started my career as a programmer. I always, again, still had that feeling like, gosh, at the end of the day, I was tired, staring at a tube and solving problems with code. I could do it. It just I didn't look forward to it.
And because of maybe some of the things that you experienced growing up, where you mentioned about your father, about how he, maybe enjoyed his job, but it was a job for him and he didn't love it, right? And maybe you jumped into that first position as kind of, this is the way it is. This is what's, expected of me, so I'm going to do it, and I'm good at it, but I don't love it, but that's okay. At what point did that shift for you, where you're like, hey, maybe I want to go find something that, I'm a little bit more passionate about?
Well, and I had an opportunity while I was doing that. Technology and training was just coming into vogue. And I started doing a few projects as part of my role since I understood the technology. And I did have a teaching heart. I started getting onto that technology and training, so doing some online. And I wasn't online learning at the time, but it was more computer-based learning at the time because there was no such thing as a network, really. Or not like we know it today, which kind of dates me. But I started doing that, and then that actually led to my first, someone within a training department of a corporation, a guy named Roger, and he saw something in me and he needed some help. He pulled me out of that job and then pulled me into a training organization, still focused on technology, but now closer to that, the hub of who, in a corporation, the teachers are in the training department. Mm-hmm. And so that was actually a pretty big career move for me, because it actually got me into an area that I could begin to see and grow and get excited about some other projects. And so over the course of probably 4 or 5 years, I little by little started taking on more and more teaching, coaching type roles. And that was really the turning point. And it was at that point that I kind of realized that you can love your job. And it's actually easier to do your work if you love it. That's not to say that sometimes you don't have to suck it up and do your work, but I began to see, oh, this is fun. And from that point on, that's kind of led me to where I was here, to where I am today.
You mentioned getting into teaching, and then you just said, oh, kind of this is fun. I'm curious, like, how do we ask questions throughout our careers, throughout our education, even with our families, with our kids, and help them experience different things, like have them have that aha moment of, oh, work can be fun and this is fun, right? How do we instill, because some people don't ever really have that happen. They stay in the same job forever, and they put in the time and they're maybe good at it, and they do the 9 to 5 and they're kind of like, this is okay, but they don't ever have that aha, work can be fun scenario.
Well, and I don't know if that the question has never really changed. It's, what gives it, what at work is more fun than hard. And sometimes the questions I'll often coach people with when they go into they ask someone from a career planning perspective. So says, I don't know. I'm like, well, in 2 years, what do you want to be doing more of, and what would you like to be doing less of? There's kind of probably 4 or 5 different questions in that space that help you just at least begin to consider, of the things that you do today, what is it that you get the most energy from, or what do you enjoy the most, or what's easier versus harder? And usually in that answer, with a little bit of self-reflection, is probably maybe a direction or a turn that you could make, or an area in which you should raise your hand faster. And that's kind of, those are the types of things I was actually doing at the time, trying to figure out what it is. And I ended up actually in a role where I was actually, I was doing career coaching and putting together within a corporation, trying to help people understand that and plot their path within an organization. So I ended up actually, and again, that kind of goes back to my theme. If I walk through it, one of the reasons why I've been thrown into situations or find myself in situations looking back is because once I get through that, including starting my own business, then I become more effective at helping people through the same spot. And so as hard as it was, I had to do it, I had to fail at Michigan Tech. I had to get fired at my job one time, and these things happen because they help you then help the next people.
Yeah, definitely. When you're in it, you don't want to be in it, but after you're out of it, it makes for a really good story that can inspire those that are in it.
Great way to say it.
And as you think about some of those things that you had to go through, what are maybe some of the hardest challenges that you've had to face?
I think there were 2 challenges that kind of got me to where I was today. One time I was with an organization, and I went to a big company. I was teaching leaders, but I wasn't leading, shockingly. I mean, it's kind of like, what? And there wasn't really opportunity to lead. So I set myself on looking for a smaller organization where I could lead, primarily in the people or HR space. Found that organization, learned a lot about small business in the meantime, but got to a point because of some of the trends in the industry we were in, which is the banking financial services, where we had to make some decisions strategically for the bank that basically made my job obsolete. So imagine this. One day we make an announcement, we're going to, my boss, who was the CEO, said, we're going to take it this way. And I'm sitting there going, well, I've been around organizations long enough. In fact, I'm in HR. I worry about structure and people and roles. That decision just eradicated the 75% of my job that I loved. I'm like, you don't need me anymore. And held on to that secret in my head for 6 months while we managed the organization through transition, which was letting go 10% of the people and, all that kind of stuff. And then around Christmas one year, we are getting ready for my performance evaluation. And I actually said that to my boss. I remember I had 3 kids at home at the time. And I said to him, you know what? You don't need me anymore. And he goes, what? I go, my job is eradicated. I mean, the one part that I loved is gone. I think I need to leave. So I fired myself. And we came into the part where it was from January, said March. We made a decision I could stay through March. We wouldn't announce it 2 weeks before I was going to leave. And I didn't have a job when I actually announced it to the organization. I had no work. And I had a family at home. My wife was happening to be staying home with the kids in that season of our lives. And so that was the first thing. That was hard. I would never tell people to do that, but I had to be honest. and honesty and trying to say the hard things has kind of been something that I just realized that sometimes you just have to be honest with things and just trust that people are going to do the right thing. And he did the right thing. I mean, he didn't fire me right off the bat, which I'm to this day grateful for him for doing that. The second thing is I went to another job, which seemed like a great job. I hated it. Big company, bureaucracy, just politics, just unhealthy. It was hard to be successful. I liked the work, but it was really hard. I ended up losing that job. I always tell people I got fired from that job, which is, you know, you got warned that, hey, you're not doing your job. And then 5 weeks later, they say, you know, we're going to restructure. I don't know what that means, but I was restructured out, whatever you want to call that. But I always tell people I was fired. And those were probably the two biggest challenges, just career-wise, just because of what they emotionally put me through. And that was, you know, when you have a career setback and it just gets at your core being and rocks you right from your self-confidence, they were for me, they were important for me in the bigger scheme of Scott Patchin, but they were brutal. At the time, they were so hard.
Yes.
So yeah, those were two big moments for me probably that have formed me.
You can definitely understand how those experiences allow you in conversations today just to fill in that empathy into some of those decisions that you help business owners walk through.
Yeah.
Because you've been on some of those restructuring type receiving ends, and it's difficult also. You know, as business owners, we're all looking for ways to be more efficient. You know, we got to raise profits, we got to do whatever to be competitive in the market. And sometimes that means making changes that are difficult to make. And, you know, I'm sure that because you were able to experience that in your life, again, at the time you didn't want to, it was tough, but that allowed for you to be who you are today, like what you described.
Yep. And they were foundational things, and they were hard.
So how did that, you obviously have, I'm going to assume here, a strong relationship with your wife. You've brought her up a couple of different times. At that time, that was probably, you know, a conversation that you guys had to really sit down and just have some long coffee talks around, right? Like, hey, you know, this is what I'm feeling at work. Do you mind talking through that a little bit? Like, how were those conversations? And was she, you know, able to jump in and support you? Or she kind of like, whatever you want to do, you do. How involved was she in that?
You know, she was involved along the way because she could see it. I mean, you know, they get to know you, and I can remember, you know, there was a year. It's funny when you look back. There was 1 year that I got kind of to the end of the year, and I asked her. You know, we were just talking about. I said, "Well, you know, what do you want to be true about this year that was different than last year?" And she looked at me and she said, "You need to help being a parent this year." And I was like, "Oh, you know, usually when I went through that kind of stuff, and I give credit to her because when you're at home and you're trying to keep the house, I mean, your focus is, I mean, she's been a rock for our family, and she's been a rock for me. I mean, when you say that, you know, we've been married now 33 years this year, and along the way, it's like, you know, she's my best friend. She knows me better than anybody. And talking through those things was huge. And a lot of times it was just processing, and sometimes processing it through behavior that just wasn't good. You know, pulling back from the family and having to, you know, needing a kick in the pants. You know, a lot of times when you're processing that with a mate, they're seeing things in you that just aren't productive behaviors for what they know you're capable of or what they know is important to you. And she's always been I would say, give me a gentle nudge. Or a kick in the pants on occasion. And that's been huge because we're not talking about days and weeks. You know, some of these things are like years. Like when you're in a tough situation or working your way out, or you do work your way out and you're still taking the baggage from that last trauma, which is a new word that I know a lot of people are familiar with. That wasn't a word 20 years ago. Trauma, when you have some of those job traumas and career traumas, it takes you a while to get rid of that kind of stuff. And so the love of someone, the unconditional love, is huge. I mean, it's been everything. I can't say enough about the role she's played in. Although I'll tell a funny story, because the day I got fired, I came home and she was out doing something, and she came home and she goes, "What are you doing home?" And so I told her the story, and she looked at me and she goes, "Scott, I've been praying something was going to happen because you've been so unhappy." And I'm like, "Hey, you could have warned me. You could have warned me you're bringing prayer into this thing because, now
I can plan for it.
Yeah, you didn't tell me that, but it made me laugh because I'm thinking, well, prayer's answered. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Here I am, honey.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was, and that's meant everything to me. She's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I love one of the descriptors that you said in rocked, right?
Rock.
And I think that that's just a theme, and one of the things that I've experienced in my own life too is just, there's difficulty that happens obviously in personal life and things like that, but business side, having that partner that you can come back and have a conversation with, and they're honest with you, right? And they're not just kind of, you can tell if they're actually listening and they actually are like in it and they want to help and support. And that might be the tough love of like kicking the pants, right? Of like, go figure it out. Come on, you know how to do this. Like, make it happen. So, no, awesome. Thank you for walking through that and describing that a little bit. Now, you mentioned you've got 4 kids.
4 kids.
4 kids. And how old are they now?
We have 29. Birthdays have been coming through. So let's just say 29, 27, 26, and 23. I know I missed one of them, and they're going to call me when they see this. Hey, Dad, you missed mine. I'm like, hey, come on, I got close.
Yeah, we said 20s, right? They're in their 20s. Cover them all. And what are they up to?
Well, it's funny. One of my son is in. He's a recruiter, so he goes and finds talent. He's got empathy, and he's been doing that now for close to 3 years. He's really good at it. So sales.
Huh.
It's funny when I could always see that in him, his ability to relate to people, his ability to connect with people, and his ability to understand what they're good at. I have 2 daughters in DC. One's in politics, kind of, working in government. And then the other one is a nurse, a critical care nurse in a pediatric hospital. And then my other daughter's going to be a teacher. She'll be done here in 2 months. So yeah, so there are 4 kids and they're all kind of launched.
Yeah.
Almost. The last one's almost launched, but she'll launch.
So now a little bit of travel. You mentioned DC. Do you still get the opportunity to all get together for holidays, or is that a little bit harder to do these days?
It's tougher, when your daughter's a nurse and she has to run back and forth. But yeah, it's funny when you have 4 kids, it's really, the more kids you have, the harder it is to get everyone in the same place at the same time. We had a wedding last year. My son got married. So now I have a daughter-in-law too. Let's not to forget to mention her. And we all got together for the wedding. We all got together for some of the events. So that actually made 2024 we had much more family time than we normally have, which was cool.
I want to back up a little bit into your transition into becoming an EOS implementer and, kind of doing your own thing and what you're up to today. What caused you to make that decision?
Well, one is I got fired. That when I left, I lost my job in 2009. And if you think about it, there were no executive level HR role. There just weren't a lot with everyone shrinking. That was a big downturn. And I knew that the problem that I'd see from working in a small business was really hard to form a team around a founder, and the dynamics and trying to get those leadership teams to work together so that they can grow the business was really hard. And I thought, I can help that. The irony for me is I didn't know EOS even existed at that moment. Gino Wickman, probably about that time, was just commercializing EOS. And it wasn't until 2014 that literally the client that I'd been doing some training and coaching with brought me traction, and they liked me, and we had a relationship, and they said, would you help us implement this? And that's where it started. And when I read Traction and I looked at what Gino had come up with, it was exactly what I felt. I'm a pretty pragmatic person in the sense that I want to get stuff done. I don't want to talk theory all the time. How can we make an impact and do stuff? And Traction is that, the traction is you don't build the vision first. You don't do the strategic planning first. You get the team structured first. Teach them management rhythms to execute on what they want to get done. Then you lay vision on top of it. And it was literally like an aha moment for me. I knew it in my head theoretically, but I was way, way down the path of, I could have never created that on my own. So I just said, I'm done doing the other stuff. I'm going to do this. And so it took me about 3 years, but I became 100% EOS in my practice.
Tell me a little bit about how that decision has impacted your, I guess, future career.
Well, I love what I do. It helps me, and being a small business owner, projecting income is really hard. When you're a consultant trying to figure out how to get work and then get the next job and line them up so you can kind of know what to expect. EOS is a predictable thing because my relationships aren't transactions; they're actual relationships. It's usually 2 to 4 years, that you're with a client, helping them to get better and build some things so that you can leave and they can keep getting better. I mean, it's been, from that perspective, I love it because I can look out and go, oh, I'm going to be working with this client for the next year. And then when they're going to graduate and I get to celebrate them and we'll stay in touch. And every now and then I'll pop back in and I'll help them with some stuff. And so it's kind of back to what I told you my story earlier. It's truly a relationship. It's not a transaction, which is what I love about it. And on top of that, one of the things I wrote a passion statement one time is maximizing growth and minimizing pain to help people move to and past that tipping point of success. I mean, that's what I love to do. I love to see that, and I love to be part of it. And the minimizing pain is kind of a funny way to look at it, but there's always an easy way and a hard way. I used to do it with my kids. I'm like, well, there's an easy way and a hard way. Which way do you want it? Every now and then they choose the hard way. I'm like, oh, how'd that work out? I mean, you still got there, but, just be thinking about that when you come to, forks in the road sometimes. And I get to do that with my clients. I get to watch them. I get to see them be successful. There's been occasions when they've gone up and gotten awards and I'm sitting in the back of the room and I'm the happiest person in there. Don't need to be recognized because I'm watching them going, all right. I mean, that's what happens all the time. As an implementer, that's what I get to do all the time.
Yeah. And even the first couple chapters of Traction kind of talks about how, business owners feel out of control sometimes, and they just feel like the business really owns them. They don't own the business. And sometimes that can feel scary, but it also can feel like, I don't like this. I don't love this feeling, and I don't, want to be doing this. And you kind of take that back to even your transition from your second job to your third job of like, hey, I realize that there is an opportunity to like what you do and love what you do. And sometimes that can be the same job that you have. It's just the way that you're going about it. You need to add some structure to it. You need to add some boundaries, some systems you need to put in place so that you have you can hold on to it and you can understand it a little bit more. It doesn't feel out of control. And now you're able to help individuals achieve that through their business.
Yeah. And I love that. I mean, thanks for making that connection back to what I said earlier, because you're right. Sometimes you just don't realize it's even possible. And that's not uncommon. It's not that you have to love 100% of your job. I mean, that's not really realistic. If you manage people, sometimes you're going to have hard conversations. If you're a salesperson, sometimes you're going to have to fill out an expense report. I'm sorry. You just got to do it. And that's just a small part of it. And you're right. And to help people see and understand the possibilities, and even with a business owner, this is even the ability to name the things that you really get energy from, that what do I want to do more of and what's less of, that's all a delegate and elevate conversation. I would love not to have to do this stuff. Well, wouldn't that great? That's finance. Could you imagine if you hired an outside accountant and they came in and did that work for you? You still get to approve all the loans and work with the banks, but you just don't have to do the transactional stuff. Really? And it's all of a sudden it's like, yeah, that's part of growth. And you can afford that. Maybe you still have to do this other stuff until you get another, 20% in sales. But it's fun to watch leaders work towards those places and realize that, and that's the critical thing. And that's what Gino saw in leaders, Gino Wickman, when he put together EOS, is this journey is not, I wish I could go in there and wave a magic wand and it happens in 3 months. It just doesn't work that way usually. And if we're talking 1 or 2 years, it happens over and over again. And that's it. That's so much fun.
Yeah. You mentioned delegate and elevate, and you mentioned just kind of that process of handing off. I think delegation is one of the things that a lot of people struggle with on their journey towards success. They feel like they have to do everything themselves because they're the best ones in the world to do it. No one else can do it better than me, of course, obviously. But then you also brought up what brings you energy. And one of the processes that I've been working through, and I've done this for several years, is a time and energy audit. And maybe you're familiar with the process similar to delegate and elevate. But really the way that it works is you basically track your time over the course of 2 weeks. Every 15 minutes, just write down everything that you do.
Yeah.
So you write it down. I've got, a couple pages, spreadsheets full of like, this is what I do every 15 minutes throughout the day. It could be anything, even at home and just throughout the day. Then I go through with a red and green highlighter, like what gives me energy, that's green. This is something that I enjoy. This gives me energy. And then something that's red, this drains my energy. This is actually something I don't like doing, right? This is frustrating to me. And just, Christmas color it, make it red and green, right? But then the time and energy too, would put dollar signs next to things like how much would it cost for me to replace or to delegate this out, or to hire, an engineer to come in and automate this for me, right? And so you put dollar signs next to everything. And the idea is that the things that are red and low dollar signs, you're either delegating them out, you're automating it, or you're, getting rid of it because those are things that aren't making you money as a business owner and aren't bringing you energy. So how do you get those out of your life quickly, right? And similar to, the quadrants and delegate and elevate, you map some of that out and you figure out a path to invest more time into the right areas. But some of the simple things come up in that is like, oh, it turns out that, cleaning my home, doing dishes around the house, doing some of those things are things I don't enjoy. Mowing my lawn, those are things I don't enjoy doing. And honestly, it's not that expensive to have someone come in and do it for you, right? So even at home, you have the opportunity to delegate some things in your home life so that you can then maybe coach with your team, spend more time with the, training with your employees, doing something that you love doing, or maybe you're just playing cards with your kids, right? And you can take some of those low energy, low dollar sign things out of your life. So similar to like what you're saying, but that's something that I've been able to practice throughout my life.
How long have you been doing that?
2 years.
And how often do you go back and do it?
Probably every quarter or every 6 months. Yeah. Every time that I feel like I'm getting to a place where I am not high energy, enjoying what I'm doing, right? And there's sometimes it's closer, I pack that closer together and I do it pretty, month after month. I'm like, okay, I missed something.
Yeah.
Other times it's, farther apart.
Well, that's a great lesson because I see that a lot with leaders that are on the delegate and elevate journey. It's the same thing. Where if you really talk to them, and I just did an interview with probably someone who is, she was the best. I mean, she's probably one of the people that's made the most progress ever. She's a chief CFO. And when you're talking to her, literally it's every quarter, like what 2 things come off my plate, or what person do I need to hire to then the next quarter hand off these 4 things. And it's amazing how but that discipline is really where it's at. It's never going to happen right away. And your life is going to, enough things are going to be changing that you're going to have to continue to bring that tool back into your habits. So that's a great lesson. I think that's the one thing people forget about. It's just in an instant fix society, sometimes they don't realize the work, the commitment that goes into that. But when you do it, all of a sudden your life is transformed after a year or 2. You're in a totally different place.
But it takes a lot of intentionality to follow a process and being okay with that change that's going to bring. And sometimes that's uncomfortable, right? Sometimes it's uncomfortable to write some of those things down and look at it.
Sometimes?
Yeah, every time.
Yeah, every time it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And in some way, it does, it causes us to be a little squeamish in there.
Yeah. But what I like about it, my background's engineering. What I like about it is it's like you facing your time and your energy like a problem that needs to be solved. And how do I dissect that into ways that I can, attack it and solve it? So when we think about if you feel like success is something that you can have intentional action around, or if that's something that more luck, more something else that comes into your life, different people that come into your life, what are some other areas that you really feel like you've been able to intentionally make decisions or intentionally put practices throughout your life to help you get to where you are today?
Usually the practices I put in place, kind of what your story just told you about, when you just talked about, kind of making lists of your time. in points in my life when I've been really, really low, like as a business owner, when I can remember a couple times when cash was just, it was up and down. I mean, I remember one time I didn't bring home a paycheck for probably, I don't know, it was 13 or 14 weeks. And as a result, you're constantly pulling out of savings to, cover things. And one of the things I found in those times is that, and again, you've kind of heard, faith is a super important part of me. And so then I began to realize that I never gave myself a chance to go into a day kind of ready for the day. I was still bringing back what was in with me yesterday when I went to bed. And so literally I started to practice 12 years ago. I don't touch email until I do 30 to 60 minutes of devotions in the morning. I don't touch it. I don't look at it. I don't start work. I answer email at 6. I don't touch it until I at least center myself around something that's a little bit more that is eternal for me. Something that's going to kind of bring me a great foundation. Lately, the thing I've added is I literally, I track I know I need 7 to 8 hours of sleep to be at my best. And I can do a few 5 or 6s, but it just doesn't, I got to make sure that I'm getting sleep, because that's probably the number one component of me being alert and sharp. I'm now vegan. I went that 3 years ago. And when I found that there's things I've noticed about myself and my energy, and so it's less about, I love what I do, but how can I be my best or be ready for my best to do that and still be there for my kids and still be there for my wife, have the energy for all that. And those have been practices that I've kind of woven in, and they primarily came from a point when I was just burning myself out. And when you find yourself in those spots where I'm burned out, and it's not that I don't love what I do. It's just, sometimes life gets overwhelming. People die, you work. I mean, there's a lot of things that hit us. And those are the types of things that I've kind of, I think probably in the last decade or two, is I've kind of begun to figure out some of those habits that help me be at my best.
I love that. So you mentioned devotions, getting good rest, and then you said so you can be your best, and then also be there for your family. And I would just tie those two things together and just be the best for your family too, right? Like a lot of times we think about like, hey, what are my morning routines that I need to get in so I can show up to work and just like be there for my team and just knock it out of the park. But then you also need to think, yeah, well, you get home at 6 o'clock, whatever time you get home, and it's dinner time. And are you still available for your kids and still available to be the best for them? And that takes another, round two of energy. So you need to be intentional about your health, what you're eating, your exercise and things like that. So you have the ability to be the best, not just at work, but then at home.
Yeah. And that's probably, you've talked a little bit about, you've alluded to success in a lot of different ways. And that's the ability to recognize success isn't just one dimensional. It's not just about work. And and being your best means being your best for the whole, everything that's in front of you. So yeah.
So now you mentioned faith, you mentioned devotions. Is that something that you do with a group of individuals that you've had the opportunity to collaborate around and do specific Bible study type scenarios, or is it just something you do on your own?
In the past, I remember probably about 25 years ago, I started up a Bible study group at a place, and that was with a group. I've gone in and out. Right now, although I still am part of groups, this is 100% on my own. It's 5:30 in the morning, cup of coffee, sitting in a corner with a couple of pillows at my back, literally. And there's different things I've done over the course of time, to kind of, what do you do with that half hour? But it's primarily been on my own. Now there's other practices in my life that are with more of a group setting, but that one is on my own.
Over your career, you've had the opportunity to obviously pour into business owners through sessions and through the EOS method, but is mentoring or inspiring others through one-on-one mentorship something that you've done in different ways throughout your career, or not really?
Yeah, I've done a lot of it. It's funny, when you're in a corporation, there's lots more people around. It was a lot easier to kind of be mentored and to mentor others because there's just the proximity of people. I think parenting is a mentorship process. I think over the course of time, I had an opportunity to mentor a bunch of people through career changes. I was part of a program called Shifting Gears, where I led that program for about 4 years. 150 people, 150 late career transition individuals, after the age of 50. So I've mentored. So yeah, I've done a lot of mentoring in different ways. I truly enjoy that. In fact, if I that's probably the one thing that whether I get paid for or not, it's going to be something that I figure out how to do for a while. I know I consider my work in EOS, you're coaching, on occasion you're mentoring in the sense that people will come to you because you'll say things in front of them, and I don't necessarily tell them my whole story all the time because the work is about them. But every now and then I'll drop something in there if it's pointed to let them know that, hey, I've kind of been at a place like this before. And then on occasion you'll hear, they'll come out one-on-one and we'll have some one-on-one conversations around some difficult, tough life things. And I consider, those are the moments that you don't have to pay me for that kind of stuff. I think I think it's a requirement to be a human being that you look for a way to lift up others. I just think that's it. Everyone should do that in some way, shape, or form. Make themselves available for somebody else.
I love that. And afterwards, I'm going to write that down. And you know why I brought that up is because, Scott, you have a series that you call, the shorts that you put online, right? You have a YouTube channel where you invest in others and you coach, like you do mentorship, but, in person, but also online. And one of the things you started doing was a short series that's called Things People Write Down When I Say It, right? Do you have some of those, one-liners, some of those things that as you say them, it's like every single time, like what you just said, someone picks up their notebook, is like, oh, I got to write that down.
Yeah, it is funny. The one that I can see the most, and you'll throw it out there is, you can't hold people accountable. You have to create conditions where people can be accountable. Because, a lot of people view leadership as this thing where they have to, spend all this energy to push people, drive them. It's like, no. You got to create conditions where they're going to want to grab the work and spend the time encouraging and developing those people, and then focus your other energy on the people who aren't picking out of. So that's one that happens a lot. Oh gosh. And it's funny when you put something on video, it's almost like it goes out of your brain. But yeah, that's the one literally that comes to mind.
Yeah.
I'd love to share 10 of them, but I'm like, my guess is someone's like, hey, what about this one? I'm like, oh yeah, I should have thought about that one.
Well, I feel like that's like a big part of, I hear things throughout just like this conversation throughout life. And I mentioned I got to grab my notebook and write that down. Is like, that's something that I've been trying to do better about, is just having a notepad on my phone of like things that I pick up or that I hear that are actually going to be helpful for me. Maybe tomorrow, maybe later, maybe while I'm traveling, maybe when I'm away from my family or something, I can just go back and read through. Like sometimes it's just having that note, those one-liners, just like those notes to kind of think back through and be reminded of, is helpful to keep those notes handy.
Yeah. Just, to that question too, there's a couple of ones that just, your strengths overused will be a weakness as a leader. If you think about, that's one that I say often, and people will be like, they don't really get the fact that, and so that's one. I love, you're right. I actually have some quote cards. One that I use a lot is, I don't know if you know Maya Angelou, if you've read much of her, but she has one that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. I think I share that one a lot, mainly because I think sometimes, and again, you mentioned you're an engineer, sometimes people are so worried about the plan, they're so worried about all the things that they have to do that they forget about how they're making, how they're going to deliver it, and how they're going to create a feeling for people based on how they set it up. And sometimes the feeling is the only long-lasting thing you leave someone with. You can fire someone, but fire them with respect and love. And I've had more clients than come back and say, 6 months later, a year later, this person came back and said, I didn't love it, what you did, but thank you. It was the right thing to do, or I appreciate how you did it. And so that quote is one that's probably the one, if I had a tattoo, that's the one I would have, because it comes in my mind all the time.
It's important. And the first one you said is your biggest strength could be your biggest weakness if overused.
Your strengths overused will become your weakness.
Your strengths overused will become your weakness.
Guaranteed.
That's alluding, I've never heard it said that way, because that's alluding back to the delegation conversation, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a big thing that, I've struggled with. Even through these conversations, I even reflect and think a little bit more about the way that I was raised and the way that I grew up in a very intentional family that worked very hard. And if they could do it, they would never, it's not like I wouldn't want to hire someone else to do it when I can just do it myself. And so especially starting my first business that I owned, Perception Engineering in 2013, it was kind of like, I'm going to do it all myself, right? I'm going to do it my way. And it was very difficult for me to hand anything off until I did get a taste of, there are others out there that also have skills and can actually do this better than I can. This is actually really nice. But it took a long time because I just wasn't raised, with that delegation piece in my mind. So you mentioned a couple things, and maybe this is the one, but I'm curious if you had the opportunity to talk to Scott when he was growing up, what's one piece of advice that you'd give yourself about your journey and about success?
I think there are a couple things I would say. One is take care of yourself a little bit earlier. I think a lot of times, you, especially in your 20s, you just burn the candle at both ends, and you don't really think about fitness and out just taking care of yourself. I think the other thing is I would tell myself to be a little bit more intentional about asking for things versus just waiting for them to come to you. I've never been a real hard driver. It's like, oh, this sounds like a great opportunity because they asked me. And I've been lucky that some people have seen some things in me, but it really probably wasn't until, I was probably mid-30s when I actually advocated for myself and said, I would really like to do this. And then I got the opportunity. And I would have told myself to do that a little bit earlier in my career.
Yeah, intentionality, and definitely pushing not only for your own interest, but if it's something that you want to grow towards, being willing to ask for help to get there. We just had this conversation not long ago about how, you're working with employees and you want to help them grow and you want to move towards a certain scenario, but if you don't pull it out of them or they don't come to you with what they want the future to look like, it makes it kind of difficult to make sure you're aligned and helping them get to that. So, as an employee, going to your manager, going to your boss and just saying, hey, I love what I'm doing. How can I provide you more value to guide in this direction? Because I'd love to do more of that. And just getting clear around it helps your manager, who probably is excited that you told them that, right? He's excited that you came to them and said, hey, this is what I'm interested in. Cool, let's try and create a path for you to get into that more. So that's exciting. Thank you for your time on this podcast and talking through your past, your history, kind of what's led you on this journey to where you are today. Now I'm going to guide into the last question of the podcast, and really it's been all leading up into this, as to, Scott, what is your definition of success?
God, that's a big question. And two things that come to mind. One is an epiphany I had when I was reading this book called Halftime one time, where they talked about moving from that concept of success to significance. And I'm kind of to the point where, although I use the word success, I think of the word significance. And if the significance I want to leave on this earth, that's one is I want to leave behind a legacy of an amazing marriage with my wife and 4 kids that are out and being the best people that they can be in this world. The second one is I want success for me, or significance for me, would be to leverage the fact that, and I joked about being privileged earlier, the kids told me, hey, if you don't know what privilege is, that means you are. I began to recognize it as a white male in this world. And it took me a while. I'm a slow learner, but it took me a while to realize I've been given things just because I'm tall and white, seriously. And when I made that epiphany, I'm like, well, what can I do to leave behind leaders that might not look like me, that I can come alongside, that may be leaders of color, so that the business, the leaders I leave behind look a lot more like the people I would see on the streets, and not necessarily the people I would run into that want to hang around that are like me. And so success for me would be to have that family, and the line that came to me because someone one time came to me and said, Scott, what would you do if you had all the money in the world? One of those pitches you get from someone to go off and create your own business and have all this money. And I said, they asked me, what do you want on your tombstone, or what would you want your eulogy to read? I said, my eulogy wants to be pretty short, surrounded by family and friends. And hopefully some of those friends would be friends of color.
Significance and surrounded by family, and then completely full circle back to how some of that foundation of the importance of family was instilled in you by your parents and your family growing up, and how they instilled that importance of work is important. It's important to earn financial success for you and your stability for your family, but the family part is the biggest piece and most important, and to help others achieve that as well. So Scott, thank you so much for being on today, and conversation. It's been amazing having you here.
Thanks for having me.